Imagine police showing up at your door with an arrest warrant. How would you feel? Now imagine the police's evidence to arrest you is a news article. What would your reaction be? What if you discovered the article was about a trip you never took in your life? And what if you also found out they used falsified entry records as evidence, with your name and passport data written incorrectly? What if I told you this is a true story that happened to a man in Brazil? A man who wasn't just arrested for a trip he never made, but was also kept in prison for 6 months. And of those 6 months, spent at least 10 days in solitary confinement, unable to see anyone or even sunlight. This is the story I want to tell you today. The story of a man who suffered one of the greatest injustices a person can endure, being targeted for supporting and befriending a former president who is being persecuted and tried for crimes he also didn't commit, but who, despite everything, remained upright, just, and faithful to his principles and values. This is Filipe Garcia Martins Pereira, a Brazilian and former special advisor for international affairs during Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, 2019-2022. One of, if not the main, person responsible for promoting Brazil's and the Bolsonaro family's rapprochement with strategic figures from Donald Trump's first administration. A man who was kept imprisoned and is now being tried for crimes he didn't commit, with evidence forged by Brazil's corrupt justice system and its accomplices. But how and why was he arrested? Everything started with Filipe Martins' preventive detention during Operation Tempus Veritatis, launched by Brazil's federal police with authorization from Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. In February 2024, Martins became one of the operation's targets based on an entry record into the United States on December 30, 2022. Yes, he was being arrested for a trip he didn't take at the end of 2022, more than a year later. This supposed trip to the US with Bolsonaro in December 2022 was used as the central allegation for his arrest. But how did they discover this record? Where did it come from? In October 2023, false journalist and Brazilian regime cheerleader Guilherme Amado published on the Metropol's website, when he still worked for the company, the article, "Bolsonaro's former advisor went to Orlando in 2022 and vanished." In the mendacious piece, Amado claimed that neither close allies nor lawyers responsible for cases involving Martins know where he is. Not satisfied with just asserting, based on his own word, that Martins had supposedly disappeared, Amado also used US I-94 form data as proof. There are only 2 problems with him using this data. The first problem is that the I-94 doesn't actually serve to prove a person's entry into the United States. It's just a guide for personal purposes, and requires the person to accept terms of use that clearly state access isn't permitted for commercial or journalistic purposes. The second, and most serious of all, is that only the person themselves can request their own I-94 form. I'm not saying anything wrong here. It's only possible to obtain Customs and Border Protection (CBP) data by providing personal information, and the form can only be requested by the person themselves. Guilherme Amado obtained Filipe Martins' data illegally. This man got information that only Martins himself could request and receive. How did he do this? How did he access this data? This is a question that still needs answers. But one thing is certain: federal police used this article as justification to arrest Martins. And it's not me saying this. It's the federal police's own documents, which not only record the article's link, but also reproduce the title. Bolsonaro's former advisor went to Orlando in 2022 and vanished. Yes, the same title as Amado's article. Curiously, after this, Guilherme Amado altered his article in several parts, especially the title, replacing "went to Orlando" with "had entry registered in the US." Did he realize he could face legal problems in the future? I don't know, but I hope he pays for the injustice he committed, especially for illegally accessing another person's confidential data in US systems. But wait, there are more suspicious and mysterious things that happened. Besides the supposed Martins entry record in the CBP system, a similar record was also discovered in the Department of Homeland Security (DHS) system, the American government agency responsible for border security. However, there was no record of Martins' exit from the US. Even so, some things remained very strange. Besides having no exit information, the name and passport number were wrong. His name, which is Filipe with 2 Is, was registered as Filipe with only 1 I. And the passport number was from an invalid document, a passport that Filipe Martins couldn't even use to enter the US. How and why would someone put Martins' wrong data in an official US government system, which only authorized government professionals have access to? Another question that needs to be answered. Even with all these absurd details about entry records in U.S. systems, Moraes refused to release Martins from prison, claiming he had circumvented the American immigration system. And this would be proof that Martins intended to flee the country and Brazilian justice. From that moment, Filipe and his lawyers began gathering evidence for his freedom. From February 2024 until his provisional release, Filipe's defense presented geolocation data, credit card purchases, receipts, and documents from various companies. They used photos, cell phone location records, food delivery app receipts, official airline documents, phone carrier data, among others. They spent months presenting evidence that Martins never left Brazil, but even so, Moraes kept him imprisoned. It was only in April 2024 that Martins' lawyers contacted the US CBP and, through American Justice, requested official documents about Martins' supposed entry on December 30, 2022. Only when the CBP officially confirmed there was no entry record on that day did things start to change for him. But don't be fooled, we're dealing with corrupt justice. Filipe Martins was still kept in prison until August 2024, when Moraes finally released him to comply with precautionary measures at home, including wearing an electronic ankle monitor. After all, why, even after all this, was Filipe still treated like a criminal? Why was he still forced to comply with restrictive measures if he wouldn't be imprisoned again? Remember, he was arrested in Operation Tempus Veritatis, an operation investigating the supposed perpetrators of an attempted coup and abolition of Brazil's democratic rule of law, whatever that means. But Filipe was treated as one of the main orchestrators and pointed out as a member of the Bolsonaro government's most radical wing. I guess I don't even need to say this coup never happened, never came close to happening, it couldn't even have happened. If you want to better understand why this coup story is a bad joke, and just another justification by Brazil's corrupt justice system to persecute opponents, watch the video on screen or in the card above. But the main reason he was kept imprisoned was different. They tried to force him to confess conversations, actions, and crimes that didn't happen, so his words could be used later in the trial and imprisonment of other defendants in the same federal police operation. But Brazil's corrupt justice system couldn't extract lies from his mouth to incriminate the others. Filipe Martins' case was, and still is, so absurd that even the Wall Street Journal published an editorial in July 2025 defending his release, citing the false records and denouncing the case internationally. At the time I'm recording this video, many things have happened. One of the main defendants accused of involvement in the supposed coup, who was tortured and psychologically threatened, confirmed that Filipe Martins didn't travel to the US with Bolsonaro, as he himself was on the flight. Curiously, he could have said this 6 months earlier and freed Filipe from unjust imprisonment. But for fear of his family suffering at the hands of Brazil's corrupt justice system, he only made this confession on July 14, 2025. Martins was authorized by U.S. Justice to sue the DHS/CBP to identify who was responsible for the fraud in the records. A new record of Filipe Martins' entry into the U.S. appeared again in the CBP system on July 16, 2025, but this time only with the name written incorrectly. It was discovered that the proof that Martins participated in a meeting with other former Bolsonaro government members to discuss a coup, which never existed, was a record with the name Felipen. Yes, Felipen, not two is and still with an N at the end. Another falsified record to incriminate him. Now, Filipe Martins is again being interrogated by the Supreme Court, along with other defendants accused of coup d'état. Filipe Martins' case isn't just a legal aberration, it's a warning to all countries. If they manage to register false data in United States border systems, why couldn't they do the same in other countries, or with other systems? We still don't know who did this, or if there's a connection with the Brazilian government, or with Democrats who helped Lula win the 2022 presidential elections when Biden was still in power. We only know that someone acted intentionally to incriminate Martins, and possibly did so believing he would turn in the other defendants in the coup case that never happened. In the end, regardless of who the forces or powerful people behind all this are, they seem to have only one plan: control the entire system and state, so that no one can act, speak, or enter the game without their authorization. For this to be implemented in Brazil, they need to destroy, arrest, and even kill, if necessary, Jair Bolsonaro and everyone connected to him, because he represents today the greatest threat to the current Brazilian regime. With Bolsonaro and his supporters out of the game, They control everything, and they do whatever they want, without fear of being challenged by someone they can't control. Even after multiple interrogations, even after months in prison, even after suffering psychological pressure, even after spending weeks isolated in prison without light, without anyone nearby, even without being able to see his own daughter for 2 years, prohibited from leaving the city where he serves measures, even imprisoned within his own home. Filipe Martins remained firm in the truth. Filipe Martins refused to lie, refused to commit injustices against innocent people, refused to lower himself to his enemy's level, refused to enter history as a cowardly man, unfaithful to his values, principles, and ideas. Filipe Martins proved to be a virtuous man in the Greek sense, rational, balanced, living according to reason and justice. And he also showed himself to be a virtuous man in the Christian sense, loving, humble, just, peaceful, and living according to God's will, not according to men's rules. Filipe Garcia Martins Pereira cannot be forgotten. He must be remembered in human history, not only for the injustices he suffered, but for the moral firmness and dignity with which he faced each one of them. In a world where truth is increasingly rare, where powerful people manipulate systems and forge evidence to destroy their opponents, Filipe Martins stands as a beacon of integrity. His story isn't just about one man's persecution. It's about the battle between truth and lies, between justice and corruption, between courage and cowardice. Freedom for Filipe Martins.
Filipe, é muito importante deixar consignado isso, porque você não vai tomar mais 50 anos como a PGR queria que você tomasse. Os 3 únicos documentos oficiais de diário oficial, foi você que trouxe o processo? Que você não viajou? Que dia 7 você não esteve na Alvorada? E que dia 19 você não esteve na Alvorada?
Todos trazidos pela minha defesa técnica.
Os documentos que a PGR, que quer te colocar na mesma masmorra que te colocaram por 6 meses, são documentos oficiais publicados em diário oficial?
Não. Não são, não estão disponíveis no Diário Oficial, não estão disponíveis ao público e não foram confrontados com nenhuma versão oficial até este momento em que nós juntamos esses documentos que estão disponíveis, inclusive em fontes públicas, em fontes abertas, para qualquer pessoa que queira fazer essa consulta.
Filipe, para a gente finalizar, o que você espera agora que você conseguiu provar a tua inocência, que o Brasil está vendo pela televisão, está televisionado os seus documentos oficiais que acabaram com esse castelo de areia? Agora que você provou a tua inocência, o que você espera desse processo, Filipe?
Eu espero justiça, eu espero que isso seja levado ao debate público desde o primeiro momento, desde o momento da minha prisão, eu tenho buscado a luz. Eu tenho tentado solicitar para que eu pudesse dar entrevistas, para que eu pudesse me expressar, porque eu sabia, como sei, que o momento que eu pudesse lançar luz sobre os fatos, todo o país ia se dar conta de que eu estou sendo acusado injustamente, de que eu fiquei preso injustamente por mais de 6 meses por uma viagem que eu não fiz, que eu me tornei réu injustamente por uma minuta que não existe, com base na palavra de um delator que muda a todo momento as suas versões, as suas declarações, e que, infelizmente, me parece acuado, acovardado e preferiu optar por esse caminho. Então, assim, eu espero, de fato, justiça. Eu entendo que há problemas graves nesse processo, desde a fase de inquérito, de modo que, se nós perseguirmos esse trajeto, talvez a contaminação inicial tenha se dado com o Mauro Cid, mas depois também com os relatórios parciais da Polícia Federal, que trazem ali informações desencontradas, que foram desmontadas aqui ao longo desse interrogatório, que eu só fui denunciado porque não havia explicações suficientes para justificar uma prisão de 6 meses, sem indiciamento, sem denúncia, por causa de uma viagem que não ocorreu e que está provado e reprovado que não ocorreu. Hoje a própria Polícia Federal admite isso, a PGR admite isso, acredito que o próprio juízo admita isso. Essa viagem não ocorreu, mas me custou 6 meses na prisão, inclusive 10 dias em solitário.
Filipe, eu quero deixar consignado aqui, público e notório, eu tenho muito orgulho de fazer parte da tua defesa, tenho muito orgulho de te defender, você é um homem honrado, tenho muito orgulho de você, então quero deixar aqui consignado, tá? Que você merece todo o meu respeito e o respeito que conquistou de todo o Brasil. Você é realmente um homem honrado e eu quero deixar isso aqui registrado. Excelência, com muito respeito, a defesa de Filipe G. Martins devolve a palavra ao juízo com muito respeito, sem mais, muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Dr. Jeffrey. Agradeço. É o senhor Filipe Garcia Martins Pereira.